They fined me $500 for unauthorized use of the lake. My lake. At first, I thought it was a joke, another one of those wall letters stuffed with nonsense about mailbox paint or grass height. But when the HOA president strutted up to me in her wide-brimmed hat, waving the violation notice like she was the sheriff of the Wild West, I realized they were serious. "You can't fish here," she sneered. "This lake is HOA property. Rules are rules." I just stood there, holding my fishing pole, biting back a laugh. These people had no idea. The lake, the dock, the woods stretching behind it, all of it belonged to me. I had the deed framed in my office. Yet they fined me, threatened to tow my truck, and when I ignored them, they actually called 911 on me. That was the moment I decided to stop playing nice. Because while the HOA thought they had power over me, they were standing on land that I owned. Every meeting, every mailbox, every fence, my property. So when I finally dropped the hammer, they never saw it coming. And the day I banned the entire HOA from their own neighborhood. That was just the beginning. The letter showed up in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, folded into one of those bland white HOA envelopes that always smelled faintly of cheap toner and smugness. You'd think they were mailing classified documents with the way, "Official Notice, Do Not Ignore," was stamped across the front in bold red letters. Normally, I would have tossed it onto the growing pile on my kitchen counter, an impressive collection of absurdities ranging from warnings about my lawn being half an inch too long, to a $50 fine for leaving my truck parked in my own driveway overnight. But something about the weight of this envelope, the self-importance practically oozing from its glue-sealed flap, made me rip it open right there on the spot, standing at the curb with the sun beating down and a fishing rod still propped against the bed of my pickup. Inside was a single page, typed in that officious Times New Roman font that HOAs seem to believe lends them the same authority as the Supreme Court. I started reading, my lips moving unconsciously as the words hit me. Notice of violation. Unauthorized use of HOA property. On September 14th, you were observed fishing in the neighborhood lake without prior authorization from the board. This constitutes a direct violation of HOA Bylaws Section 4.3 subsection B, pertaining to the recreational use of common property. A fine of $500 has been assessed to your account, due within 30 days. I read it again, slower this time, as if maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something less insane. But no, they had actually fined me $500 for fishing in the lake. My lake. At first, I laughed, loud, sharp, almost manic. I stood there on the curb with the letter fluttering in my hand, neighbors walking their dogs giving me strange looks, and I laughed until my ribs hurt. Because if I didn't laugh, I might have marched straight to the HOA president's door and given her a piece of my mind she would never forget. The audacity was breathtaking. It wasn't enough that they policed the color of mailboxes and demanded grass be cut at regulation length, now they were policing fish. As if summoned by the thought, here came Linda Dawson herself, the self-crowned queen of the HOA. She strutted down the sidewalk in her sun hat wide enough to double as a satellite dish, a clipboard tucked under one arm, lips pinched into that permanent scowl that looked like she'd smelled something sour in 1993 and hadn't recovered since. Beside her trailed two other board members, Barry and Denise, faithful lieutenants in her little suburban empire. They spotted me holding the letter, and Linda's eyes lit up like a hawk spotting prey. "Ah, I see you've received your notice," she said, her tone sweet as antifreeze. She tilted her head, waiting for me to grovel or at least look ashamed. I tucked the paper back into the envelope with exaggerated care. "You fined me for fishing." She nodded, proud as if she'd just recited the Pledge of Allegiance. "Yes, you were in violation. The lake is common property and requires board approval for recreational use. We cannot have residents treating it like their personal playground." I leaned against my truck, crossing my arms. "Linda, it is my playground. I own that lake." Her laugh was sharp and dismissive, the kind of laugh people give when they think they're talking to an idiot. "Don't be ridiculous. The lake is managed by the HOA, as outlined in our bylaws. If you'd like to file an appeal, you can attend the next board meeting, though I should warn you, appeals are rarely successful." Behind her, Barry nodded solemnly like he was a Supreme Court justice backing her up, while Denise scribbled notes on her clipboard as though this moment needed documentation for posterity. I couldn't decide if the whole thing was more infuriating or hilarious. "Tell you what," I said, pushing off the truck and folding the envelope neatly into my back pocket. "I'll think about it." Linda's eyes narrowed. She didn't like that. She liked people who rolled over, who wrote checks without question, who said, "Thank you," when she fined them for leaving Christmas lights up too long. I had never fit into that category, and the fact clearly gnawed at her. "You should take this seriously," she said, lowering her voice as if she were delivering a threat in a mafia movie. "Non-payment of fines can lead to liens against your property. We will enforce compliance." I gave her my calmest smile, the one that always made my brother joke I looked like a man about to bet the farm at a poker table. "Oh, I'm taking it seriously. Very seriously." That smile unsettled her just enough to make her pull back, adjusting her hat and muttering something to her entourage before marching off to ruin someone else's afternoon. I watched them go, shaking my head. It wasn't just the fine. It was the principle. Here was a group of self-important busybodies who truly believed they ran this neighborhood like monarchs, issuing decrees and punishments from their cul-de-sac throne. And now, they were trying to stake a claim over the one thing I held sacred, the lake. The lake wasn't just water and fish to me. It was history. It was where my father had taught me to cast a line when I was 6, where summer evenings stretched into night with nothing but the chorus of frogs and the hum of crickets. Years ago, when the developer was strapped for cash, I'd quietly bought the parcel that included the lake, the surrounding dock, even the old maintenance shed that now served as a clubhouse. I'd never flaunted it. I let the neighbors use it freely, because community mattered more than bragging rights. But seeing that letter, hearing Linda's smug voice, something in me snapped. They had no idea they were standing on my property every time they held their precious board meetings in that clubhouse. They had no clue that the land beneath their chairs, their banners, even the stupid podium Linda loved to pound with her gavel, all of it was mine. And maybe, just maybe, it was time they learned. But not yet, not today. Today I folded the letter, tucked it into my pocket, and went back to fishing. I cast my line into the rippling water, watching the bobber dance lazily in the afternoon sun. Each ripple felt like a secret I held close to my chest, a quiet reminder that the lake was mine no matter what the WA scribbled on their paper. And as I waited for the first bite, I couldn't help but chuckle. Because if Linda Dawson thought a $500 fine was the end of this story, she had no idea what storm was about to hit her. The letter about the lake wasn't the first warning shot the WA had fired at me, not by a long stretch. If anything, it was the climax of a long, ridiculous feud that had been simmering ever since I moved into this neighborhood 5 years ago. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The signs were everywhere, tucked inside those same white envelopes, carried on the lips of neighbors whispering complaints, and in the smug little smile of Linda Dawson whenever she, reminded us of her authority. My very first notice had come not even a week after I moved in. I was still surrounded by boxes, eating takeout on an upturned cooler, when a knock rattled my door. Standing there was Linda, clipboard in hand, peering over the rims of her oversized sunglasses like she was an IRS auditor. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said in a tone that made it sound less like a greeting and more like a summons. She barely let me say thanks before pointing out that my grass was already beginning to exceed the acceptable length. I'd been living there for 6 days. 6. I remember blinking at her, holding a half-eaten slice of pizza, wondering if she was joking. She wasn't. From that moment forward, the letters never stopped. 1 month, they fined me because the shade of white I'd painted my mailbox was apparently not the approved eggshell. Another time, they warned me that my truck, parked in my own driveway, was an unsightly commercial vehicle. I had to laugh at that one. A 10-year-old Ford F-150 wasn't commercial, it was just honest. But Linda and her board weren't interested in honesty, only conformity. The pettiness was their sport. They hunted for violations like bloodhounds, prowling the neighborhood with clipboards and cameras. I once caught Barry crouching in my front yard, actually measuring my grass with a ruler like a man checking evidence at a crime scene. When I asked him what in the world he was doing, he stammered something about community standards, before scurrying off, nearly tripping over my garden hose. Neighbors complained too, but mostly in hushed tones. Everyone had a story. Denise once fined the Johnsons for having excessive seasonal decorations, because their Halloween skeleton was too tall. The Ramirez family got slapped with a warning because their teenage son parked his basketball hoop near the sidewalk. And who could forget the infamous Santa incident, when Linda threatened to tow the inflatable Santa from the Jenkins front lawn because it exceeded the allowable height for holiday displays. The Jenkins had retaliated by adding 2 more Santas the next night, and for a brief, glorious moment, the entire neighborhood rallied behind them. But Linda, true to form, doubled down, citing bylaws until the Jenkins eventually caved. That was her power. She wore people down with paperwork, with threats of liens and fines, until compliance felt easier than resistance. Me, I didn't have that kind of patience. Every notice felt like a mosquito bite, small but infuriating, an itch I couldn't scratch. I paid the smaller fines just to keep the wolves at bay, but the resentment built up, layer after layer, until it sat in my chest like a weight. Sometimes, when I was mowing the lawn or fixing the fence, I'd imagine Linda in some throne room, sitting on a chair made of mailboxes and clipboards, ruling over as peasants while Barry and Denise stood guard at her side. It was ridiculous, but not nearly as ridiculous as the reality. Because for Linda, being HOA president wasn't a volunteer gig, it was her entire identity. She strutted around like a mayor, puffed up with authority, convinced she held dominion over every square inch of this neighborhood. And the worst part, she was relentless. One summer, during a brutal heatwave, I'd parked my truck under the shade of the big oak near the lake. Within an hour, I had a violation notice tucked under my windshield wiper, unauthorized parking near common property. Never mind that no one else was around, that I wasn't blocking a soul. The rule existed, therefore I was guilty. Another time, I left my garbage bins at the curb a day early because I was heading out of town. I came back to not one but 3 warnings taped to my front door, each escalating in tone like I was some hardened criminal. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action. Disciplinary action, for trash bins. I half expected them to sentence me to hard labor in the clubhouse basement. Neighbors had begun joking about it behind Linda's back. They called her, the warden, and the HOA board, the tribunal. But jokes could only carry you so far when your wallet was bleeding fines. I'd seen grown men reduced to groveling at meetings, begging to have their penalties reduced, only for Linda to smile thinly and say, "Rules are rules." That was her mantra. She wielded it like a sword, cutting down anyone who dared step out of line. Still, through it all, I had one sanctuary, the lake. That stretch of water, with its rippling surface and quiet banks, was where I could breathe. After a long day of work, I'd grab my pole, walk down to the dock, and let the world melt away. No letters, no fines, no Linda. Just the steady tug of the line, the evening breeze, and the chorus of cicadas. It was mine in a way nothing else in this neighborhood was. Which is exactly why the lake violation was the final straw. Because while Linda saw a pond to regulate, I saw a legacy. My father had taught me to fish there. I'd brought dates there as a teenager, skipping rocks until the stars came out. Years later, when the developer sold it off, I jumped at the chance to buy it, even if no one else cared. Owning it wasn't about prestige, it was about protecting something sacred. And now Linda wanted to slap a fine on it as if it were just another mailbox or lawn ornament. The warning signs had always been there. The letters, the nitpicking, the smug smirks at board meetings. But that envelope about the lake was different. It wasn't just another mosquito bite, it was a knife. A declaration of war. Linda didn't know it yet, but she'd poked the wrong bear. I'd tolerated her nonsense long enough, let her collect her petty victories. But this time, I wasn't going to fold. This time, I was going to fight back. And not just with words or appeals. I had something far stronger than her bylaws, something she could never argue down with a clipboard. I had the deed. It happened on a Saturday, one of those golden afternoons when the sun hangs just right in the sky and the whole world feels like it's been dipped in honey. I had my fishing pole propped in the dirt, a cooler of cold drinks beside me, and the lake spread out before me like a sheet of glass. For once, I felt calm, peaceful. The only sounds were the buzzing of cicadas, the splash of a fish breaking the surface, and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood. That's when I heard the click of expensive sandals on the dock. I didn't even need to look up, I knew who it was. Sure enough, there she stood, Linda Dawson, queen of the HOA, her sun hat tilted like a crown, clipboard clutched like a royal scepter. Behind her trailed Barry and Denise, as faithful as ever, like a pair of poorly trained bodyguards. "You are in violation again," Linda announced, her voice carrying across the water as though she were addressing a courtroom instead of one tired man with a fishing rod. I leaned back in my chair, tipping the brim of my cap to shade my eyes. "Afternoon to you too, Linda. Care for a drink? Water, soda, maybe a reality check?" Barry let out a scandalized gasp, and Denise scribbled something on her clipboard like she was documenting my sarcasm as Exhibit A. Linda didn't flinch. She never flinched. Instead, She stepped closer, pointing one manicured finger toward the lake. You have been warned. You cannot fish here without board approval. You are trespassing on HOA property. I nearly choked on my laugh. Trespassing? Linda, you're standing on my dock, overlooking my lake, and you're telling me I'm trespassing. That's a bold strategy. Her eyes narrowed. You do not own this lake. The HOA bylaws clearly. Bite me, I said, cutting her off. I've got the deed framed in my office if you'd like to see it. Or maybe you'd prefer I staple a copy to the next ridiculous violation notice you shove in my mailbox. That rattled her. Just a flicker, but I saw it. She covered it quickly, snapping her fingers at Barry like he was a servant. Call them, she ordered. Barry blinked. Call who? The police, she hissed. We are not negotiating with this behavior any longer. He is in direct violation of HOA rules, and if he refuses to comply, we escalate. Now it was my turn to blink. You're calling 911 on me. For fishing. What are you going to tell them? That I'm armed with worms and a cooler of Pepsi? But Barry was already fumbling with his phone, looking half terrified, half thrilled, like a man who couldn't believe he was about to dial the nuclear codes. I sat back in my chair, shaking my head, and cracked open another soda just to drive the point home. If they wanted to make fools of themselves, who was I to stop them? 15 minutes later, the flashing lights appeared at the end of the road. 2 patrol cars rolled up, tires crunching against the gravel, and out stepped a pair of uniformed officers who looked equal parts annoyed and amused. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on his day shift. The other was younger, his eyes darting between the HOA posse and me like he was silently begging the universe not to make him write a report about fishing. Linda practically sprinted to them, waving her clipboard like it was a holy relic. Officers, thank goodness you're here. We have a trespasser. He refuses to leave HOA property, despite multiple warnings. He's combative, rude, and deliberately violating community standards. I demand you remove him immediately. The tall officer looked past her at me, lounging in my chair with my fishing pole and cooler, and then back at her. This guy, with the fishing rod, yes, she snapped. He's endangering the community by ignoring the rules. This is an HOA-managed body of water, and... Ma'am, the officer interrupted, his voice calm but edged with weariness, this doesn't really sound like a criminal matter. This sounds like a civil dispute. Linda's jaw dropped as if he'd just denied the laws of physics. Civil dispute. He's trespassing. I stood then, stretching slowly, and walked toward the group with the most relaxed smile I could muster. Afternoon, officers. Sorry to drag you out here over this nonsense. Just so we're clear, this lake is mine. Bought it years ago. Got the deed in my office if anyone wants to see it. But I'm guessing you'd rather not waste your time over a guy with a fishing pole. The younger cop bit back a grin. The older one sighed. Sir, if you do own the lake, then this isn't really something we can enforce. Exactly, I said, spreading my hands. But apparently Linda here thinks HOA bylaws outrank property law. The officers exchanged a look, one of those silent cop-to-cop conversations that said, this is above our pay grade, but let's shut it down quick. The older one turned back to Linda. Ma'am, unless you can produce evidence that the lake belongs to the HOA, there's nothing we can do here. If it's a property dispute, you'll need to take it up in civil court. Linda's face turned a shade of red I'd only ever seen on overcooked lobsters. Evidence. We have evidence. We have bylaws, regulations, and years of precedent. Do you have a deed? I asked sweetly. She sputtered, her mouth opening and closing like a fish flopping on dry land. Barry shifted uncomfortably, while Denise's pen finally stilled on her clipboard. For the first time, cracks were showing in the perfect facade of the HOA machine. The older cop pinched the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, we're not getting involved in this. Settle it through the proper channels. For now, we're leaving. He turned to me, his expression caught somewhere between apology and disbelief. Have a good day, sir. Try not to antagonize your HOA. No promises, I said, giving him a wink. They left, their patrol cars rumbling away, leaving behind the faint echo of laughter from the younger cop. I swear I saw him shaking his head, probably already planning to tell this story at the station. Linda, however, wasn't laughing. She stood rooted to the dock, trembling with indignation, her knuckles white around the clipboard. This isn't over, she hissed. You will regret this. I picked up my fishing pole and flicked the line back into the water, settling into my chair as though the entire episode had been nothing more than an inconvenient commercial break. I look forward to it, I said. But in the meantime, you're standing on private property. Kindly get off my dock. The way she stormed off, sandals slapping the wood like gunshots, was almost worth the fine itself. Barry trailed after her, mumbling something about calling the board, while Denise looked like she wanted to crawl into the lake and disappear. I leaned back, savoring the silence that followed, broken only by the soft plop of my bobber dancing in the water. And that was the moment it clicked for me. Linda wasn't going to stop. Not after today, not after losing face in front of the police. If anything, she'd double down. She'd dig her claws deeper, rally her board, and try to bury me in paperwork, fines, and threats. But what she didn't know, what made me smile to myself as I reeled in the first fish of the day, was that she was already fighting a losing battle. She thought she held all the cards, but she was standing on a house of paper, and I had a match. The war had officially begun. Long before Linda and her clipboard brigade decided to declare war on me, long before the flashing patrol cars rolled up to the dock, there was the day I signed my name on a stack of papers in a dusty little office downtown and quietly changed the balance of power in this neighborhood forever. Nobody knew it then, not the neighbors who waved at me from their driveways, not the developer who thought he was cutting a routine deal, and certainly not the future queen of the HOA, but that deed was the ace I had been holding in my pocket all along. And if the lake violation was the spark, the deed was the barrel of gasoline just waiting for the match. It all started years ago, when the neighborhood was still half built and the developer was running out of money faster than concrete was being poured. I remember walking through empty lots with grass up to my knees, the skeleton frames of houses baking in the sun, and a half-finished clubhouse that looked more like an abandoned barn than a future community center. At the time, no one cared about the lake. It was just a muddy body of water, filled with cattails and mosquitoes, more liability than acid. The developer wanted out, fast, and he was willing to sell the land parcels that included the lake, the dock, and the surrounding acreage for cheap. Most people saw a swamp. I saw history. That lake had been part of my life since I was a kid. My father used to drive me out here before the subdivision even existed, back when the road was just gravel and the only structures were barbed wire fences and leaning barns. We'd sit on the banks for hours, him showing me how to bait a hook, how to cast without snagging, how to be patient enough to let the fish come to you instead of thrashing around scaring them off. He used to say the lake was more than water. It was a mirror. It showed you who you were when you were quiet enough to notice. I didn't fully get it then, but I do now. Those were some of the best memories of my childhood, and when I heard the lake might be up for grabs, I didn't hesitate. I met the developer in his office, a cramped place above a strip mall, papers piled on every surface, a fan buzzing lazily in the corner. He was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, his tie hanging loose, his eyes darting to the phone as though it might bite him. "You really want the lake?" he asked, incredulous. "You know it's not exactly prime real estate. Maintenance, liability, all that headache, it's not worth it." "It's worth it to me," I said. And it was. I didn't tell him about my father or the fishing trips or the way the lake calmed me when the rest of life felt like a storm. I just signed the papers, wrote the check, and walked out of there with a folded deed that made me the quiet owner of what everyone else dismissed as dead weight. For years, I let it be. I didn't hang a sign, didn't build fences, didn't lord it over anyone. The neighbors were welcome to use it, kids swam in it in the summer, families picnicked by the shore, and nobody asked questions. Why would they? To them, it was just part of the neighborhood, a nice perk of living here. The HOA, back when it was small and sleepy, didn't pay much attention to it. They were too busy figuring out how to organize bake sales and whether to plant tulips or marigolds at the entrance. Nobody thought to ask who owned the lake, and I wasn't about to volunteer the information. I liked the peace, but then came Linda. She moved in with her husband, a man I've rarely seen because he seems to have perfected the art of vanishing whenever she starts talking. Almost overnight, she rose to power in the HOA. One moment she was just another neighbor with a yappy little dog, the next she was barking orders at meetings, waving around bylaws like gospel. She professionalized the pettiness. Where the old HOA had been a nuisance, she turned it into a weapon. And like any conqueror, she set her sights on territory. It started small. The clubhouse was suddenly under HOA management. Then the walking trails. Then the dock. Each time, she drafted rules, imposed regulations, printed new forms. Neighbors just nodded along, too tired or too busy to argue. After all, who cared who managed what, as long as they could still use it? But I watched her carefully, saying nothing, letting her believe she was tightening her grip when in reality she was just building her little empire on ground she didn't own. I kept the deed tucked away in my office, framed on the wall not because I needed to show it off but because I liked seeing it there, a reminder of what was real in a world full of WA fantasy. Sometimes, when another ridiculous violation notice showed up in my mailbox, I'd glance at that frame and smile, knowing I could end the game whenever I wanted. But patience is a tricky thing. My father had taught me to wait for the right moment, just like fishing. You don't yank the line the second you feel a nibble, you wait until the fish has really bitten. The lake fine, that was the bite. The 911 call, that was the hook setting. The funny part was, Linda had no idea how fragile her whole operation was. She strutted around quoting bylaws, but bylaws don't trump deeds. Her rules had weight only because people believed they did. The moment I showed the truth, her empire would collapse like a sandcastle in the tide. And oh, how I was going to enjoy it. I thought back to the day I first brought my own son to the lake. He was 7, restless, more interested in his Game Boy than the bobber floating on the water. But when the first fish tugged, his eyes lit up just like mine had years before. I remembered thinking then that the lake was more than a body of water, it was a thread that tied generations together, something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. And now, thanks to Linda's arrogance, I finally had a reason to fight. The neighbors didn't know yet. They were still trapped in the fog of WA intimidation, still paying fines for mailbox colors and trash bins. But soon, very soon, they would see what I saw, that Linda's throne was built on my land. And when I finally pulled out that deed, when I dropped it like a hammer in the middle of one of her smug little board meetings, the sound of it would echo through every cul-de-sac and driveway in this neighborhood. For now, though, I kept my secret close, watching, waiting, biding my time. The lake shimmered before me in the late afternoon light, calm and timeless, holding the weight of all my memories. Linda thought she had the upper hand. She thought she could find me, threaten me, even sick the cops on me, and I'd eventually bend like everyone else. But she was wrong. She was playing checkers, and I'd been playing chess for years. The deed was my queen, and I hadn't even moved her yet. The morning after the cops left my dock shaking their heads, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in one hand, and caught sight of something I hadn't seen in a long time, a smirk. Not a smile, not a grin, but that dangerous little curve at the corner of my mouth that always meant trouble was brewing. I'd worn it in high school right before sneaking out with my buddies, I'd worn it in college when I knew I was about to hustle a pool table full of strangers, and now I was wearing it again because Linda Dawson thought she had me cornered. The truth was, she hadn't even seen the board yet. She was too busy puffing herself up with bylaws and fines to notice the ground crumbling beneath her feet. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no reason to rush. I had the deed, I had the power, but sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't in dropping the hammer right away. Sometimes it's in letting the other side build their tower higher and higher, just so you can watch it topple from a greater height. So I waited. The following week, the violations doubled. I got one for leaving my trash can visible, for an unreasonable period of time, 30 minutes, apparently. Another for having unauthorized plantings, because I'd added a couple of tomato plants near my back porch. The best one, though, was the improper storage of recreational equipment, fine, which was their fancy way of saying I'd left my fishing rod leaning against the side of my garage. Linda was on a roll, firing off letters like a machine gunner, and instead of making me mad, it made me laugh. Each notice was another shovel of dirt she was throwing onto her own grave. The neighbors noticed too. They'd always grumbled about the WA, but lately the grumbles had grown louder. Old Mr. Jenkins, the same guy who'd once battled Linda over his inflatable Santa, stopped me on the sidewalk one morning and whispered like we were co-conspirators. "She fined me for wind chimes," he said, his voice incredulous. "Wind chimes. Said they were a noise disturbance." "You believe that?" His wife tugged at his sleeve, urging him to lower his voice, but I could see it in his eyes, he was tired. They all were. The Ramirez family had it worse. Their teenage son had parked his beat-up Honda at the curb overnight, and Linda slapped them with a violation for street clutter. Street clutter, as if a kid's car was a pile of old tires. The boy had painted, WA equals fun police, on his back window the next day, and I nearly spit out my coffee laughing when I drove by. That kind of quiet rebellion was spreading. People were tired of being told what color to paint their shutters or how many flowers they could plant. They were tired of living in fear of the clipboard patrol. And though none of them knew it yet, they were about to get a champion in this fight. Meanwhile, I sat back and let it happen. I paid none of the fines, ignored every letter, and when Linda would corner me in public, wagging her finger and rattling off rules like a human megaphone, I just smiled that same infuriating smirk. The more unbothered I acted, the more unhinged she became. One Saturday, she stormed up to me while I was washing my truck and hissed, "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can get away with this?" I shrugged. "Seems like it." Her face turned the color of a ripe tomato. "We have procedures. We have power." "Then by all means," I said, flicking the water hose off and coiling it slowly, "use it." She stomped off, her sandals slapping against the pavement, muttering to herself like a cartoon villain. I stood there, dripping sponge in hand, and laughed so hard my neighbor across the street peeked out her blinds to see what the fuss was about. The thing about war is that it's not always fought with weapons. Sometimes it's fought with patience, with silence, with the kind of calm that drives your opponent mad. Linda didn't know how to handle calm. She thrived on fear, on neighbors bowing their heads and mumbling apologies, on checks written quietly just to make her go away. I wasn't giving her any of that. I was giving her smirks and shrugs, and it was eating her alive. But I wasn't just sitting idle. Oh no, I was preparing. I pulled out the deed from my office wall and made fresh copies. I went to the county office and got certified duplicates, stamped and notarized, ironclad proof that no bylaw could touch. I organized my files, lined up every bit of evidence I needed, and even had a lawyer friend review it just for fun. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said after flipping through the papers. "Honestly, this is going to be hilarious when you drop it on them." Exactly what I was counting on. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and I decided that would be the battlefield. Until then, I let Linda stew. Every time she looked at me, every time she saw me cast my line into the lake or park my truck in the driveway, she must have wondered what game I was playing. And that was the best part, I wasn't playing her game at all. I was playing mine. Word spread around the neighborhood. People started coming up to me, testing the waters. "You really told the cops you own the lake?" one neighbor asked, eyes wide with a mix of hope and disbelief. "Is it true?" another whispered when Linda wasn't around. I just gave them that same smirk and said, "You'll see." It became a kind of legend, a rumor bubbling beneath the surface. Linda tried to stamp it out, of course, holding little sidewalk lectures about misinformation and community property rights, but the seed of doubt had been planted. And doubt is poison to a tyrant's rule. I spent those 2 weeks not stewing over fines, not arguing over bylaws, but preparing for the grand reveal. Every time I looked at the lake, shimmering in the evening sun, I pictured the look on Linda's face when I dropped the deed on the table. I pictured Barry's mouth hanging open, Denise's pen falling out of her hand, the neighbors erupting in whispers and gasps. I pictured the power shifting, the crown slipping right off Linda's head, and the glorious silence that would follow. And so I smirked, every morning brushing my teeth, every evening casting a line, every time I pulled another HOA letter from the mailbox, I smirked. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't even confidence, it was inevitability. The war had already been decided. Linda just didn't know she'd already lost. The night of the HOA meeting arrived like the finale of a bad soap opera, thick with anticipation, drama, and just the right amount of ridiculousness. I parked my truck at the curb outside the clubhouse, my clubhouse, though nobody but me knew it yet, and sat for a moment, watching. Neighbors file in, some carried folded papers, others whispered behind their hands, and a few wore the grim expressions of people being hauled before a tribunal. The fluorescent lights inside flickered to life, and the silhouettes of Linda and her board moved around like they were preparing for trial. I tightened my grip on the folder that held my deed copies, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't smirking. I was grinning. Tonight was the night the hammer dropped. The clubhouse smelled like cheap carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Folding chairs lined the walls, and a long plastic table sat at the front like a judge's bench. Linda was already stationed behind it, posture stiff, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who thought they were about to crush a bug. Barry, her ever-faithful vice president, adjusted his tie nervously, and Denise shuffled papers, clicking her pen like a nervous tick. Neighbors filled the chairs, murmuring quietly, eyes darting toward me as I entered. I nodded, calm, carrying my folder like it was no more important than a grocery list. "Let's call this meeting to order," Linda announced, banging a little wooden gavel she'd bought online. Her voice carried with that sharp, nasal authority that grated on everyone's nerves. "We have several pressing issues to address tonight, not least of which is repeated noncompliance from certain residents." Her eyes locked on me like twin laser beams. A hush fell across the room. I just sat down in the front row, folding my arms, perfectly relaxed. Linda launched into her performance, rattling off violation after violation, complete with pictures stapled to her notes: my trash can, my fishing pole, my tomatoes. She loved her evidence, loved the theatrics of parading it out for everyone to see. "This kind of blatant disregard for our community's rules cannot stand," she declared, her voice rising with each syllable. "We are a neighborhood of standards. We have procedures. Without compliance, there is chaos." She paused, waiting for applause, but the room stayed quiet. A cough in the back. Someone shifted in their chair. People weren't as impressed as she hoped, and that only made her push harder. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice tightening, "this resident has openly defied not only written warnings but direct instructions from this board. And, most egregiously, he has trespassed on HOA property by continuing to use the lake." Gasps rippled through the room. I watched as neighbors glanced at one another, some confused, some skeptical. "That was my cue. Actually," I said, standing slowly, folder in hand, "that's where you're wrong." My voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that cuts through noise like a blade. Heads turned. All eyes shifted to me. Linda's smile faltered, just a twitch, but enough for me to see the crack forming. She recovered quickly, sneering. "Mr. Henderson, you will have your chance to speak when I grant it." "I think I'll speak now," I replied, stepping closer to the table. "Because while you've been handing out fines like candy at Halloween, you've forgotten something important. The lake isn't HOA property." The room erupted in murmurs. Linda's eyes widened, then narrowed to slits. "Excuse me." I placed the folder on the table with a soft thud, slid a copy of the deed across to Barry, then another to Denise, and finally one directly in front of Linda. "It's mine. Bought it fair and square years ago. The lake, the dock, the land this clubhouse sits on, all mine. And unless you can produce something stronger than county-certified documentation, you've been fining me for fishing in my own backyard." For a moment, silence swallowed the room whole. The kind of silence that buzzes in your ears. Then, chaos. Neighbors gasped, some laughed outright, others muttered, "I knew it." Denise fumbled with the papers, her hands shaking as she scanned the stamps and signatures. Barry's jaw dropped so far it looked like it might dislocate. And Linda, well, Linda looked like someone had pulled the rug out from under her while she was balancing on a tightrope. This is nonsense," she stammered, shoving the deed back across the table. "Forgery. Lies. You can't own." "It's not nonsense," I interrupted, my smirk returning full force. "It's legal fact, and unless you want to explain to the county judge why your board has been trespassing on private property, I suggest you stop throwing around words like forgery." The neighbors leaned in, hanging on every word. For years they'd endured her tyranny, and now they were watching it collapse in real time. One man in the back, Jenkins with his wind chimes, actually clapped his hands once before his wife shushed him. "I own the lake," I repeated slowly, letting the words sink in. "In this clubhouse, which means you've been holding your little meetings on my property. So, if we're talking about trespassing, Linda, maybe you should start with yourself." A ripple of laughter broke out, hushed but unstoppable. Linda's face darkened, her nostrils flaring. "You can't. This doesn't. There must be a mistake." "No mistake," I said, turning to the crowd. "I've tolerated the fines, the harassment, even the ridiculous call to the police. But I've stayed quiet long enough. Tonight, you all see the truth. This board doesn't own power over me, or you. They've been pretending, and I think you've all had enough of the act." The neighbors murmured their agreement, louder this time, emboldened by the shift in power. For the first time in years, Linda wasn't in control of the room. She opened her mouth to shout, but no one was listening anymore. Barry cleared his throat weakly. "Well, maybe we should, review these documents carefully before making any." I cut him off. "Review them all you want. They'll say the same thing every time. You've been playing queen of the castle on land that doesn't belong to you. And now the game's over." I leaned closer to Linda, just enough so she could see the fire in my eyes. You thought you had me cornered. But you never even realized you were standing in my house the whole time. And with that, I picked up my folder, turned toward the crowd, and walked out. Behind me, voices erupted, questions, laughter, outrage, a cacophony of disbelief and satisfaction. But I didn't need to hear it. I'd already won. Outside, under the cool night sky, I finally let the grin break wide across my face. For weeks I'd smirked in secret, biding my time, savoring the moment. Now it was here, and the look on Linda's face would be etched in my memory forever. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the first battle had ended, and I'd drawn first blood. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like a hornet's nest that someone had just kicked wide open. Word about the deed spread faster than wildfire, faster than any of Linda's newsletters or threatening emails ever had. People whispered over fences, cars slowed down when passing my house, and everywhere I went I could feel eyes on me, not with suspicion this time but with a mix of curiosity, hope, and maybe even a little awe. For years, Linda had walked around like she owned the place, but now everyone knew the truth. She had been strutting across land that wasn't hers, barking orders from a throne that never existed. And the best part, I didn't even have to say much. The deed did the talking for me. Linda, of course, didn't take it well. By noon, she had fired off a special bulletin to every resident's email, stamped with that ridiculous wall logo she loved so much. The subject line screamed, "Community Update, Disinformation Alert." In the body of the email, she claimed I was spreading false documents, that the HOA's legal team was reviewing the situation, and that no one should fall victim to deceitful claims meant to undermine community standards. She even bolded, "deceitful claims," like it was a scarlet letter. The problem was, by then, neighbors had already seen copies of the deed. Jenkins showed his wife, who showed her bridge group, who showed the Ramirez family, who showed just about everyone else. The certified stamps, the signatures, the county seal, it was all there. Linda could scream, "Forgery," until she turned purple, but the truth was undeniable. That evening, I went for a walk around the lake, my lake, and found myself joined by half a dozen neighbors who just happened to be out for fresh air. Jenkins shuffled along beside me, chuckling under his breath. "You should have seen her face last night," he said, shaking his head like a man reliving the best scene in his favorite movie. "I thought she was going to pass out right there in front of everyone." The Ramirez boy, trailing behind with his hands shoved in his hoodie, grinned and said, "Legend, man. Straight up legend." As much as I enjoyed their reactions, I kept my answers measured, careful. "It's not about me," I said, though inside I was still savoring every detail of Linda's meltdown. "It's about fairness. They've been walking all over people for too long. It had to stop." That seemed to resonate. Neighbors nodded, their eyes lighting up, and I could almost see the weight lifting off their shoulders. The spell was breaking. The fear was gone. Linda tried to regroup. A few days later, she called another emergency meeting, though this one didn't have the turnout she was expecting. Half the chairs sat empty, and those who did show up weren't there to nod along anymore. They came with questions, sharp ones. "Why did you say the lake was WA property if the deed says otherwise?" One woman demanded. "What happens to all the money from the fines?" Another asked, her voice trembling with anger. "Why are we paying fees for a clubhouse that's not even ours?" The board squirmed like children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Barry dabbed sweat from his forehead, Denise shuffled papers without speaking, and Linda, well, Linda did what Linda always did when cornered, she doubled down. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, plastering on a brittle smile. "We are working with attorneys to resolve it. In the meantime, I expect full compliance from all residents. The rules are the rules, and we cannot allow chaos." But her words, once delivered with a whip crack that kept everyone in line, now landed with a dull thud. Nobody was afraid anymore. Nobody cared. The emperor had no clothes, and everyone in the room could see it. After the meeting, neighbors huddled together in groups, openly ignoring Linda's glares. They talked about organizing, about demanding answers, about voting the board out altogether. Jenkins muttered something about burning the bylaws in his fire pit. Even the quiet ones, the folks who normally kept their heads down, started speaking up. I didn't have to lead the charge, the deed had done that for me. All I had to do was stand there, hands in my pockets, and let the cracks spread until the whole structure came tumbling down. Of course, Linda wasn't finished. She sent me another violation notice, this one accusing me of displaying hostility toward the board by spreading misinformation. I laughed so hard when I opened it that I nearly choked on my coffee. It was desperation in paper form, a last gasp of a drowning tyrant. Instead of tearing it up, I pinned it on my refrigerator like a trophy. A reminder of just how weak she had become. Meanwhile, the neighborhood started shifting. For the first time in years, people put out decorations without worrying about citations. Jenkins hung his wind chimes again, proudly this time, and when Linda marched past his house with her clipboard, he stood on his porch and jingled them like victory bells. The Ramirez boy parked his Honda at the curb with all the defiance of a warrior planting his flag. Even small rebellions felt monumental because they weren't really about the objects, they were about freedom. I could see Linda unraveling with every act of defiance. She patrolled harder, wrote more notices, stomped up and down the sidewalks muttering about lawlessness and disgrace. But the more she pushed, the less anyone cared. Her words had lost their teeth. She was a barking dog behind a fence, all noise and no bite, and everyone finally knew it. Behind the scenes, I knew she was scrambling. She called the county office, demanded explanations, tried to dig up any loophole that might give her ground to stand on. But the law was the law, and the papers were clear. The property was mine, and no amount of yelling or foot stomping could change that. My lawyer friend called me one afternoon, nearly laughing through the phone. She actually tried to claim adverse possession, he said, as if holding meetings in your building for a few years gives her ownership. The clerk nearly fell out of his chair. The cracks widened into chasms. Neighbors who once feared her began mocking her openly. The Ramirez boy made a meme of her face pasted onto a cartoon villain, complete with a cape and pitchfork, and passed it around the block. Jenkins nicknamed her Lake Linda, and it stuck like glue. Even kids started chanting it when she walked by, their laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac. Linda had wanted control, but what she got was ridicule, and nothing destroys authority faster than being laughed at. One night, I sat on my dock, watching the sunset paint the lake gold, and thought about how quickly things had turned. Just weeks ago, she had called the cops on me, smug and confident, certain she held all the cards. Now she was the one cornered, flailing, watching her empire crumble piece by piece. The lake reflected the sky in perfect calm, as if mocking the storm raging in her world. I cast my line, leaned back, and let the smirk stretch across my face. The wall wasn't dead yet, but it was dying, gasping for breath, its power leaking away faster than Linda could patch the holes. She could fight, she could scream, she could write 1,000 more violation notices, but it wouldn't matter. The neighbors had seen the truth. They weren't afraid anymore. The spell was broken, and once fear is gone, control follows. Collapse wasn't coming. Collapse had already begun. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that feels like it should slip quietly into the week, but instead it exploded into history for our little neighborhood. The air was crisp, the sun sharp against the lake's surface, and I'd just finished mowing my lawn when I saw Linda and her posse marching up the street like stormtroopers on parade. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose like she thought they made her look intimidating instead of ridiculous, she had Barry on one side, Denise on the other, and a couple of new board volunteers trailing behind like ducklings. They stopped in front of my property, staring at the clubhouse across the water as though they could will it back into their possession with enough indignation. I leaned on my mower handle and waited, already knowing this was the day I'd been preparing for. Linda jabbed her finger at the clubhouse. "We're holding our meeting there tonight," she announced, voice sharp, like she was daring me to object. "And you can't stop us. This is community property." I walked up slowly, wiping sweat off my forehead with the back of my hand, savoring the moment. "No, Linda," I said, pulling a folded paper from my back pocket, "it's my property. And as of today, I'm formally revoking your right to use it." She froze, her eyes flickering to the paper in my hand, the official notice I'd drafted with my lawyer friend. It was stamped, signed, and crystal clear, effective immediately. The law was trespassing if they set foot in the clubhouse or the land surrounding it. I handed her a copy, gave one to Barry, one to Denise, and held the last out for the ducklings, though they just stared like deer in headlights. "You can't do this," Linda sputtered, her voice cracking for the first time. We've been meeting here for years." "Doesn't matter if it's been years or decades," I said evenly. "It was never yours, and now I'm putting it in writing. Step foot in that clubhouse again, and I'll have the sheriff remove you for trespassing." The silence that followed was delicious. Neighbors had begun drifting out of their houses, drawn by the standoff like moths to a flame. Jenkins leaned on his cane at the end of his driveway, grinning ear to ear. The Ramirez boy actually pulled out his phone and started recording, whispering, "This is gold," under his breath. The crowd grew with every passing second, and Linda knew she was losing her audience. She puffed up her chest, tried to rally. "This is an outrage. He can't do this. We have bylaws, we have authority." I cut her off with a smirk. "Authority doesn't mean a thing when you're standing on land you don't own. And for the record, Linda, those bylaws stop at my property line. Which means, from now on, you're banned." The word hung in the air like a gavel strike. Banned. It rolled through the crowd, setting off whispers, chuckles, even a couple of cheers. Linda's face went from red to pale to an odd shade of blotchy purple. Barry tugged nervously at his collar. Denise looked like she wanted to disappear into the asphalt, and the ducklings. They were already backing away, realizing they'd picked the wrong parade to join. "This isn't over," Linda hissed, clutching the paper in her hand so tightly it crumpled. "You'll regret this. The WA will not be humiliated." "Too late for that," I said, turning my back on her and starting up my mower again. Meeting's over before it started. And just like that, the line was drawn. By sunset, the entire neighborhood knew the WA had been kicked out of its own clubhouse. People gathered in driveways, laughing, sharing stories, shaking their heads in disbelief. Jenkins lit a cigar and declared it was the best day since he'd retired. The Ramirez boy uploaded the video online, and within hours it had hundreds of views on some local forum. Even the quietest neighbors, the ones who never so much as waved when you passed, were smiling when I walked by. That night, I sat on my dock, fishing pole in hand, listening to the crickets sing. From across the lake, I could see the clubhouse lights still dark, the windows black, empty. It was mine now, not just legally but practically. The WA had been evicted. Their kingdom was gone, but I wasn't done. Over the next few days, I installed new locks on the clubhouse doors and posted fresh signs at the entrance of the property: private property, no trespassing. I even hired a buddy with a tow truck to park near the lot during the hours Linda liked to schedule her meetings. If she wanted to test me, she'd find her car on a hook before she could blink. Sure enough, she tried. The following Thursday, she marched up with Barry and Denise in tow, waving her clipboard like it was a magic wand. But when she reached the doors and saw the locks changed, the signs posted, and half the neighborhood watching from their lawns, she lost it. She rattled the handles, pounded on the doors, shouted about illegal occupation and violations of community trust. I just stood a few yards away, arms crossed, calm as a stone. When she turned to me and screeched, "Open this door, or I'll call the police," I pulled out my phone, dialed the sheriff's office, and said, "Yes, I've got trespassers on my property. Could you send someone by?" The look on her face when the deputies pulled up was pure theater. She tried to argue, tried to flash her WA badge like it was some kind of government ID, but the deputies weren't buying it. They checked the deed copies, nodded, and told her plainly, "Ma'am, if you set foot on this property again without permission, you can and will be arrested." The crowd watching erupted into cheers so loud the crickets stopped chirping. Jenkins whistled through his fingers like he was at a ball game. The Ramirez boy shouted, "Game over, Lake Linda," and the nickname rang out like a victory chant. Linda stomped away, humiliated, her heels clacking against the pavement like angry punctuation marks. Barry trailed behind her, muttering apologies to anyone who'd listen, and Denise scurried off so fast she nearly tripped over her own feet. It was the last time they ever tried to hold a meeting on my land. The next morning, I brewed my coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the sun rise over the water. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. People waved more, smiled more, even stopped to chat like they hadn't in years. The fear was gone. The reign of the HOA had been broken, not with lawyers or drawn-out battles, but with one simple word: banned. And every time I looked across the lake at that empty clubhouse, silent and dark, I felt the same thought settle in my chest like a warm ember: this was only the beginning. If Chapter 8 of this whole saga was the eviction, then Chapter 9 was the funeral. Not a literal one, of course, but the slow, painful, public death of Linda's control. After the deputies told her, plain as day, to stay off my land or risk arrest, something in her broke. She still strutted around the neighborhood with her clipboard tucked under her arm, but her voice didn't carry the same whip crack anymore. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes darted nervously, and her words came out more like pleas than commands. The neighbors noticed. They always noticed, and the more they saw her falter, the more they turned away from her and toward each other. It started small. Jenkins, God bless him, put out a 12-foot inflatable reindeer in his front yard 2 months early, just to see what would happen. Linda stopped in front of it, stood there for a long moment with her pen hovering over the violation. Slip, and then, she walked away. No citation, no confrontation. Just silence. Word of that spread faster than gossip at a high school cafeteria, and suddenly, everyone was testing her. The Ramirez boy parked his Honda diagonally across his driveway, blocking part of the sidewalk. Mrs. Kowalski down the street planted flamingo statues all over her lawn. The Petersons hosted a barbecue with music so loud it rattled windows. And every time, Linda showed up, ready to pounce, but ended up swallowing her words and leaving empty-handed. The clipboard was still there, but the bite was gone. I thought that might be enough humiliation to break her spirit, but Linda was nothing if not stubborn. She still sent out emails, angry, desperate, increasingly unhinged emails. She accused me of usurping community spaces, claimed the sheriff had been duped by fraudulent paperwork, and insisted the wall would rise again stronger than ever. Nobody believed her anymore. Most people stopped opening her emails entirely. Jenkins told me he set up a filter so all of her messages went straight to spam. The Ramirez boy forwarded one of her rants to his entire high school group chat, and by the next day, Linda's ramblings were being roasted by teenagers who didn't even live in our neighborhood. The real breaking point came at the next official HOA meeting, if you could still call it that. With the clubhouse off limits, Linda tried to host it on the patch of grass near the playground. She set up a folding table, dragged out her gavel, and taped a sign to the jungle gym that read, "Board in session." Only about a dozen people showed up, and most of them weren't there to support her, they were there for the spectacle. I didn't plan on attending, but when I saw the crowd gathering from my dock, I couldn't resist. I wandered over, coffee in hand, and leaned against a tree at the edge of the gathering. Linda banged her gavel like she was presiding over the Supreme Court. "This community is under attack," she declared, her voice shrill and cracking. "We cannot allow one man to undermine the authority that keeps us safe and orderly. We must stand together." Her words fell flat. Nobody clapped. Nobody even nodded. A kid on the swings laughed out loud. Barry avoided eye contact. Denise scribbled furiously in her notebook as though if she just wrote enough, reality would change, and the rest of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some smirking, some shaking their heads. I raised my coffee cup in her direction and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Careful, Linda. You're trespassing." The crowd erupted in laughter. Even people who had once feared her couldn't hold back. The Ramirez boy nearly doubled over, and Jenkins laughed so hard he wheezed. Linda's face crumpled right there in front of everyone, and for the first time, she didn't shout back. She didn't defend herself. She just slammed her gavel down, muttered something incoherent, and stormed off with Barry and Denise trailing behind her like embarrassed assistants. The so-called meeting ended before it began. That was the day the neighbors stopped calling it an HOA. From then on, it was Linda's fan club, or the clipboard committee, and eventually just the joke. People started talking about life before Linda, life after Linda, and how they'd never let someone like her hold that kind of sway again. A quiet rebellion turned into open celebration. Lawns sprouted pink flamingos, inflatable Santas, garden gnomes, and even a giant plywood cutout of a shark wearing sunglasses that someone stuck by the lake. It was chaos, colorful, hilarious chaos, and it felt like freedom. And Linda, she cracked. I saw her one evening standing outside her house, tearing one of her own violation slips in half with trembling hands, muttering under her breath. Barry stopped coming around. Denise resigned from the board in a tear-streaked email that simply read, "I can't do this anymore." The so-called HOA meetings dwindled to nothing, the gavel collected dust, and the once mighty president of our neighborhood was reduced to a bitter woman pacing her porch, ignored by the very people she once ruled. One morning, I walked past her house and noticed a "for sale" sign staked in her yard. It leaned slightly, as though even the sign itself had lost the will to stand tall. Linda stood on the porch, arms crossed, glaring at me as if it were all my fault, which, of course, it was. I gave her a friendly wave and kept walking. She didn't wave back. Her eyes were glassy, red-rimmed, and for the first time, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But any sympathy was drowned out by the laughter, the joy, the relief that pulsed through the neighborhood. We held our own gatherings now, barbecues, potlucks, lakeside bonfires, all without permission slips or fines. Jenkins brought his wind chimes and strung them from a tree near the water. The Ramirez boy parked his car wherever he pleased and blasted music with the windows down. Kids chalked the sidewalks with wild colors, turning the cul-de-sac into a canvas. And every time I cast my fishing line into the lake, I could hear the hum of contentment all around me, the sound of people finally free from the tyranny of a clipboard. Sweet revenge tastes different than you imagine. It's not sharp or fiery, it's smooth, warm, and lingering, like the first sip of good whiskey. Watching Linda unravel, watching her power crumble and her tears dry into bitterness, wasn't about cruelty. It was about balance, about a bully finally meeting the wall she couldn't knock down, about a neighborhood reclaiming itself. And every time someone laughed, every time I saw a plastic flamingo or heard Jenkins' wind chimes, I thought, this is better than any fine, better than any victory speech. This was justice, messy and loud and perfect. Sweet revenge, bitter tears. Linda's empire was gone, and in its place was something better than rules and fines, freedom. The lake was quiet the morning after Linda's for sale sign went up. I woke early, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and walked down to the dock barefoot, the boards cool under my feet. The sun had just begun to creep over the horizon, turning the water into a sheet of gold, smooth and perfect except for the occasional ripple from a fish breaking the surface. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt absolute peace. The drama, the shouting, the fines, the endless battles with clipboards and bylaws, they were all behind me now. Linda was leaving, the HOA was dead, and the lake, this stretch of calm, shimmering water they'd tried to find me for, police me over, control out from under me, was mine. I thought back to that first day when they sent me a notice demanding money for unauthorized modifications to the shoreline. They saw the lake as theirs, a feature they controlled, a tool to enforce their power. I saw it as home, as freedom, as something alive and untamable. And in the end, that difference had broken them. The WA tried to cage water, to fence in sunlight, to write rules about ripples and reflections. But you can't own a lake by committee. You can't bottle freedom, you can only live in it, and that's what I had done from the moment I moved here. As I sipped my coffee, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Jenkins, cane tapping the boards as he made his way down. He wore his old fishing hat, the one with the frayed brim and the faded patch that read "Born to Fish, Forced to Work." He lowered himself carefully onto a chair at the dock's edge and let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Beautiful morning," he said. "Best one yet," I replied. We sat in silence for a while, watching the water. Eventually, Jenkins chuckled. "Never thought I'd see the day. Linda gone, clipboard buried, and is still standing. You did it, son. You really did it." I shook my head. "We did it. Everyone who stopped listening to her, everyone who stopped being afraid, that's what killed the HOA. I just lit the match." Jenkins nodded slowly. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. This neighborhood feels alive again. Feels like the place I moved into 30 years ago, before all the nonsense started." He tapped his cane lightly on the dock, a rhythm like a satisfied heartbeat. The sound of laughter drifted across the water. On the far side of the lake, the Ramirez boy was skipping rocks with his little sister. A few houses down, the Petersons were setting up for another one of their weekend barbecues, smoke already curling up from the grill. Mrs. Kowalski's flamingos gleamed pink in the morning light, a ridiculous and wonderful rebellion that had become a neighborhood landmark. Linda's house sat dark and silent. The sign in the yard stood like a tombstone, and though I half expected to see her pacing the porch, glaring with that familiar fury, there was no one. She was gone, or close to it, her reign reduced to a memory, her empire dismantled piece by piece until nothing was left but bitterness. In me, I had the lake. That evening, I hosted a gathering at the clubhouse, my clubhouse. Not an HOA meeting, not a board session, not a tribunal of fines and violations. A real gathering. I sent word around, and by sundown, the place was full. Jenkins sat by the fireplace telling stories from his younger days. Kids ran around with sparklers in their hands, their laughter ringing through the halls that had once echoed with Linda's lectures. The Petersons brought ribs, Mrs. Kowalski brought a pie so sweet it barely lasted 10 minutes, and the Ramirez boys set up speakers and played music that made everyone's feet tap. I stood at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the wall, just watching. Watching neighbors who had once lived under the same shadow now laugh together freely. Watching people I barely knew a year ago hug, share food, tell jokes, and act like a community again. And I realized something: the HOA hadn't just tried to control me. They had smothered all of us, drained the joy out of the simplest things: Christmas lights, lawn decorations, kids playing outside. They'd replaced living with regulation. And now, without them, life had rushed back in like water into a dry creek bed. When the night wound down and the last of the neighbors drifted home, I stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the lake. The moon hung low and bright, casting silver across the water. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and let the cool night air settle into my lungs. This wasn't just victory, it was vindication. They had tried to find me for my lake, tried to use rules and threats and even 911 calls to push me into submission. And all along, they didn't realize the truth. I owned the land, I owned the clubhouse, I owned the lake. I thought about Linda then. About her tears, her anger, her stubborn refusal to let go of control. Maybe somewhere deep inside, she believed she was protecting order, preserving beauty, keeping chaos at bay. But rules without compassion aren't order, they're cages. And when you put people in cages long enough, eventually they'll tear the bars apart. She had underestimated all of us, and it cost her everything. I raised my glass, half a tumbler of whiskey this time instead of coffee, toward the lake and whispered, "Here's to freedom. Here's to peace. Here's to the lake." The water rippled gently, as if answering back. The next morning, the neighborhood woke not to fines or threats, but to birdsong and sunlight. And for the first time in years, nobody worried about their grass length, their paint color, or whether their holiday lights were too festive. They worried about nothing at all, and that was exactly how it should be. The HOA was gone. The fear was gone, and the lake, my lake, was finally, truly mine.